Socrates, a name synonymous with wisdom, a symbol of philosophy, and the father of critical thinking. While he didn't outright invent the concept, his method of inquiry and relentless pursuit of truth laid the foundations for what we nowadays call critical thinking. But how did one man over thousands of years ago create such a lasting impact by just asking questions? How did his life, his method, and his philosophy shape not only the way we think, but how we challenge ideas and seek understanding? Picture ancient Athens. It's the cultural hub of the world, filled with ideas, art, and political debates. People are talking about everything: democracy, warfare, the gods, but most accept certain things as givens. Enter Socrates, a man who would stop random Athenians in the marketplace and start asking them questions like, what is virtue, or what makes a good life? Now, most people think they know the answers to these questions. After all, aren't these basic concepts? But Socrates wasn't satisfied with surface-level responses. He didn't want pre-packaged answers. Instead, he dug deeper, revealing that many of the things people thought they knew were actually full of contradictions. And that's where his real genius lies. He didn't provide answers, but his questions led others to question their own beliefs and eventually uncover flaws in their thinking. This approach was so revolutionary that it changed not only philosophy, but the way humans think about thinking itself. So, how did he do this? Socrates developed what's now known as the Socratic method, essentially a way of thinking that revolves around asking the right questions. But what's the big deal about asking questions? Well, think about it. When was the last time you really questioned something? We're surrounded by so much information every day that we often accept things without really thinking them through. Socrates flipped this idea on its head. He believed that the only way to get to the truth was through persistent questioning. For example, in Plato's dialogues, we see Socrates engaging in conversations where he challenges people on concepts such as justice, love, or piety. He didn't tell them what these things were. He made them explain, re-explain, and reconsider their answers until they realized that their understanding wasn't as solid as they thought. This is the root of critical thinking. Not just accepting what you hear, but continuously interrogating your own assumptions. Today, we use this method in science, law, education, you name it. But Socrates was doing this way earlier, out in the streets of Athens with ordinary people. One of the most intriguing parts of Socrates' philosophy is his famous declaration, "I know that I know nothing." At first glance, this sounds like an odd statement for someone who's often regarded as one of the greatest thinkers in history. But Socrates didn't mean it literally. He wasn't saying he was ignorant. What he was suggesting instead was something deeper, that true wisdom comes from recognizing the limits of your own knowledge. Think about that for a moment. Socrates was living in a world full of people who claimed to have all the answers. Politicians, poets, religious leaders. But Socrates believed that the first step toward wisdom was admitting how little you actually know. How many times have you come across someone who's completely sure of their opinion, no matter what evidence or alternative perspectives are presented? Socrates reminds us that being too certain can actually blind us the truth. Admitting you don't know everything will instead open the door to learning more. Now, as you might imagine, not everyone was thrilled with Socrates' constant questioning. In fact, his relentless pursuit of truth eventually led to his trial and death. Socrates was charged with corrupting the youth of Athens and disrespecting the gods. But here's the kicker. What really bothered people wasn't that Socrates was teaching dangerous ideas. It was that he was making people think too much, challenging the status quo. In his trial, Socrates didn't back down. He stood firm, famously saying that the unexamined life is not worth living. He argued that living without constantly questioning and reflecting on what's right and what's true isn't really living at all. But the jury didn't see it that way, and Socrates was sentenced to death. Even when faced with this extreme consequence, Socrates chose to die rather than stop his mission of critical inquiry. In a sense, his death became the ultimate symbol of the power and danger of critical thinking. But Socrates isn't just relevant to philosophers or scientists. His method of critical thinking can be applied to everyday life. How often do we simply accept things at face value? From news headlines to social media posts, we're constantly bombarded with information that demands our attention. But do we ever stop to ask, is this true? Why do I believe this? How do I know? Socrates would argue that this kind of reflection is essential to a meaningful life. Whether it's about choosing a career, forming opinions on social issues, or even deciding how to spend our free time, critical thinking helps us make decisions that are thoughtful, informed, and authentic. The beauty of Socratic questioning is that it's not about being a skeptic for the sake of it. It's about genuine curiosity. It's about peeling back the layers and getting to the heart of the matter. And in a world that's constantly changing, that's a skill we could all use. So, did Socrates invent critical thinking? Not exactly, but he certainly shaped it into what it is today. In the end, Socrates didn't give us answers. He gave us something far more valuable. The tools to find those answers ourselves. And perhaps that's why, after more than 2 millennia, his questions are still worth asking.